Most relationships do not end with a dramatic moment. There is no single conversation that breaks everything apart. No obvious, undeniable event that makes the decision clear. No moment where the universe lines up and tells you exactly what to do. Most relationships end the way a fire dies, not with a sudden explosion, but slowly, quietly, one ember at a time. And by the time most people realize what is happening, they have already been living inside a dying relationship for months, sometimes years, carrying the weight of something that stopped working long before they were willing to admit it. And here is the part that makes this so difficult. You still love them, or at least you love who they were, or who you believed they could become, or the version of the relationship that existed in the beginning, before the tension became the default setting and the silence started feeling louder than any argument. And that love, real as it is, makes it nearly impossible to see clearly, because society handed you a story about love from the very beginning. And the story said, if it is real, you fight for it. If it matters, you stay. If you leave, you failed. That story is the reason so many people stay in situations that are quietly destroying them. And today, we are going to dismantle that story completely. Because knowing when to leave a relationship is not a sign of weakness. It is not a sign of failure. It is not evidence that you did not try hard enough, or care deeply enough, or give enough of yourself. Sometimes, it is the most courageous, honest, and genuinely loving thing you can do. For them, for yourself, for the future that both of you deserve, but cannot build together. Let us start with something that most people are never told directly. Love alone is not enough. Say that again, slowly, and let it settle. Love alone is not enough. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about relationships, and it is also one of the most important, because the cultural story around love is almost entirely emotional. It focuses on feelings, on intensity, on the electricity of connection and the warmth of deep affection. And those things are real, they matter, but they are not the complete picture, because you can love someone deeply, genuinely, completely, with everything you have, and still be completely wrong for each other. You can love someone and want entirely different futures. You can love someone and bring out the worst in each other rather than the best. You can love someone and still create a dynamic between you that is slowly, steadily, undeniably damaging both of your lives. Love is an emotion. Compatibility is a structure, and a relationship requires both. When the emotional connection is powerful, but the structural compatibility is broken, when the values do not align, when the life visions point in opposite directions, when the patterns of interaction consistently produce more damage than growth, love becomes something tragic. It becomes the reason you stay in a situation that is hurting you. And no one tells you this when you are young. No one sits you down and explains that the depth of your feelings for someone is not, by itself, evidence that the relationship is healthy, that you can miss someone and still need to leave them, that you can want someone back and still know that going back would be a mistake, that love and wisdom are not always pointing in the same direction, and learning to hold both of those truths at the same time, to honor the love while also being honest about what the relationship is actually producing in your life, is one of the hardest things a person can do. But it is also the beginning of clarity. Now let us talk about why leaving is so difficult, even when it is clearly necessary. Because if you have ever stayed in a relationship long past the point where it was serving you, you already know that the decision is never as simple as just recognizing that something is wrong. Recognizing is the easy part. Deciding is infinitely harder. And the reason for this difficulty goes deeper than emotion. There is a well-documented psychological pattern that researchers call the sunk cost effect. The basic idea is this: the more you have invested in something, time, emotion, energy, identity, shared history, the harder it becomes to walk away from it, even when the evidence clearly suggests you should. Because leaving does not just mean losing the relationship. It means confronting the possibility that all of that investment was, on some level, for nothing. That the years you spent, the adjustments you made, the parts of yourself you quietly set aside to keep the peace, the other opportunities you did not pursue because you were committed to this, the version of your future you imagined, planned, and organized your entire life around. All of that now has to be grieved. Not just the relationship, all of it. And grief is painful in a way that is genuinely difficult to overstate. So the mind finds a more comfortable alternative. It finds reasons to stay. It finds moments of temporary improvement and treats them as evidence of permanent change. It finds memories of the good times and amplifies them. It minimizes the problems. It tells you that leaving would be giving up, and that giving up is weakness, and that the right thing, the strong thing, the loving thing, is to keep trying. And sometimes that is true. Sometimes relationships go through genuinely difficult periods that require commitment and patience and real work to move through. But sometimes the mind is simply doing what it was designed to do, avoiding the pain of loss by reframing a necessary ending as a solvable problem. And knowing the difference between those two situations is exactly what we need to develop the clarity to see. Let us talk about the first signal that something has shifted past the point of temporary difficulty. Constant emotional exhaustion. Not the tiredness of a hard week. Not the fatigue of a difficult conversation that eventually reached resolution. Not the natural friction of two people navigating a genuinely challenging period in their lives, but a persistent, chronic, bone-deep exhaustion that lives in the relationship itself. The kind where you feel drained before the interaction even begins, where you find yourself dreading conversations that used to feel easy, where the anticipation of being around this person produces anxiety rather than warmth, where you leave most encounters feeling worse than when you arrived, heavier, more confused, less like yourself. This is important to understand. Healthy relationships are not always easy. They involve disagreement, compromise, and real emotional effort. But they are fundamentally energizing in the overall balance. They add to your life more than they subtract from it. They leave you feeling, over time and across the broad arc of the relationship, more capable and more alive. When the opposite is consistently true, when the relationship is a net drain on your emotional resources, month after month, with no sustainable improvement, that pattern is telling you something. Not as an accusation, not as a verdict against either person, but as honest information. Because your emotional state is not separate from the relationship. It is a direct reflection of what the relationship is producing. And if what it is consistently producing is depletion, if you feel smaller, more anxious, more depleted, more disconnected from yourself as a result of being in it, then the relationship has stopped being a source of support in your life. It has become the primary source of stress. And that is not a small thing. That is a signal worth taking seriously. Now, here is the part that most people do not want to examine too closely, because it requires a level of honesty that feels uncomfortable. Ask yourself, genuinely and without defense, when was the last time you felt genuinely at peace inside this relationship? Not happy in a fleeting, momentary sense. At peace. Settled. Safe. Genuinely okay with who you are becoming and where you are going. Because for many people in relationships that have quietly broken down, the answer to that question is a long time ago, and they know it. But they have learned to manage the distance between that knowledge and their daily behavior. They have learned to stay busy enough that the question does not surface too loudly, to focus on the small positive moments as evidence that the whole is still working, to reframe the chronic stress as personal weakness rather than relational reality, to convince themselves that what they are feeling is about them, their anxiety, their attachment issues, their unrealistic expectations, rather than about what the relationship is actually producing. And sometimes that self-examination is appropriate. Sometimes the problem is internal and the relationship is genuinely healthy. But sometimes the self-blame is a strategy for avoiding the harder truth, that the relationship has become a place where your peace goes to disappear. And you deserve better than that. Not as a statement of ego, as a statement of basic human necessity. You deserve a life that feels livable from the inside. Let us talk about the second signal, respect. Specifically, the slow, quiet disappearance of it. Because disrespect in relationships almost never announces itself loudly at the beginning. It does not arrive as obvious cruelty or dramatic contempt. It arrives in small increments. A comment that is slightly too sharp. A dismissal that is slightly too casual. A moment of public embarrassment that is immediately minimized. A pattern of your opinions being treated as less important, your feelings as less valid, your perspective as less worth engaging seriously. None of these moments, taken individually, feel catastrophic. Each one can be explained away. They were tired. They were stressed. It was a bad day. It meant nothing. But patterns do not lie, even when individual moments can be rationalized. And what these patterns are describing, when they accumulate consistently over time, is a fundamental shift in the power dynamic of the relationship. Your presence in this relationship is no longer being experienced as the presence of an equal. It is being experienced as something lesser, as something to be managed, tolerated, or occasionally appeased, but not genuinely respected. And here is why this matters beyond the obvious emotional pain of feeling disrespected. Attraction and respect are structurally connected in a way that cannot be separated. When one erodes, the other follows. You cannot sustain genuine desire, the kind of deep, lasting attraction that makes a long-term relationship worth having, for someone you do not fundamentally respect. And they cannot sustain it for you if the dynamic has positioned you as someone less worthy of respect. Which means that the slow disappearance of respect is not just an emotional problem. It is a structural problem. It reshapes the foundation of the relationship in ways that affection and good intentions alone cannot repair. And recognizing that pattern, really seeing it clearly without the protective instinct to minimize or excuse it, is one of the most important things you can do for yourself. There is a third signal that deserves serious attention, and it is perhaps the most insidious of all, because it does not feel like the relationship hurting you. It feels like you simply becoming less. The slow erosion of your identity inside the relationship. Think about who you were before this relationship became the center of your life. The interests you had, the friendships you maintained, the personal goals you were pursuing, the version of yourself that existed independently and found meaning and direction outside of this one relationship. Now look at where those things are. For many people in relationships that have become unhealthy, the honest answer is that most of those things have quietly disappeared. Not through any single dramatic moment, but through 1,000 small negotiations. The hobby you stopped pursuing because it created tension. The friendship that faded because spending time with them always seemed to require more justification than it was worth. The professional goal you deprioritized because the relationship needed more of your energy. The version of yourself who had clear opinions and comfortable boundaries and a life that felt genuinely your own. Quietly replaced by a version of yourself who is mostly managing the dynamic, managing the tension, managing the emotional weather of another person at the expense of your own internal landscape. This is important. Healthy relationships do not require you to become smaller to survive. They expand your life. They create more space for you to become who you are, not less. They add dimensions to your identity rather than subtracting them. When the opposite is true, when the relationship has become a process of gradual self-erasure, that is not love functioning as it should. That is something that needs to be honestly named. Now let us talk about communication, because this is where most relationship advice completely misses the point. Standard advice says, communicate better, communicate more, learn to express your needs more clearly, and listen more carefully, and the problems will resolve. And in genuinely healthy relationships with resolvable conflicts, that is often true. Communication is powerful. But there is a moment, and if you have been in a difficult relationship long enough, you know exactly the moment I am describing, when communication stops working. Not because you are doing it wrong, not because the technique is flawed, but because the underlying structural problem that the communication is trying to address is not actually solvable through conversation. You have had the same conversation 15 times, the same acknowledgement of the problem, the same promises of change, the same genuine intention, perhaps, to do something different this time, followed by the same pattern reasserting itself within days or weeks, and you go back to the conversation. Again, because you were told that the answer is always more communication. But what you are actually experiencing is a pattern that is not responding to the intervention. And at some point, the question shifts from how do we communicate better about this problem to why is this pattern still here after all of this time and all of this conversation? Because some patterns exist not because of miscommunication. They exist because of genuine incompatibility, because of fundamentally different values, because of attachment styles that consistently collide in ways that produce damage, regardless of how clearly either person expresses themselves, because of unresolved individual issues that no amount of couple communication can substitute for. And when communication has become circular, when the same conversation leads to the same temporary improvement, leads to the same regression, leads to the same conversation, that circularity is itself the information. It is telling you that the problem is deeper than the conversation can reach. And that is a crucial thing to understand. There is also something that happens inside a person who stays in a relationship driven primarily by fear. And it is worth examining honestly. Because fear is an extraordinarily effective trap. Not because it is irrational. The fears that keep people in relationships they know they should leave are often completely understandable. Fear of being alone. That one is real, deep and human and completely understandable. Especially after years spent with someone, the idea of navigating daily life without them can feel genuinely terrifying. Fear of starting over. Also real. The prospect of rebuilding, new routines, new connections, new vulnerability with someone new can feel exhausting even to imagine, especially when you are already depleted. Fear of hurting them. This one is particularly powerful for empathetic people. The knowledge that leaving will cause pain, that you will be the person responsible for that pain, that someone you care about will suffer as a direct result of your decision. These fears deserve to be acknowledged. They are not weaknesses. They are not signs of emotional immaturity. They are signs that you are a human being capable of genuine attachment and genuine empathy. But here is the thing about making decisions from fear. Fear is not wisdom. Fear is information about what feels threatening in the immediate moment. Wisdom is the ability to look past the immediate feeling toward the longer arc. And the longer arc, when a relationship is being held together primarily by the fear of leaving, rather than by genuine desire and mutual growth, almost always leads to the same place. More of the same. Months, years, sometimes decades of more of the same. Until the accumulated weight of staying in the wrong situation has cost both people something that cannot be fully recovered. The version of themselves they were supposed to become. The life they were supposed to build. The relationships with themselves, with others, that the space and freedom of an honest ending would have made possible. Let us talk about compatibility in a way that is more specific and more honest than most conversations about relationships allow. Because compatibility is not about whether you enjoy the same activities or laugh at the same jokes. Those things can be genuinely wonderful. But they are surface-level compatibility. Deep compatibility, the kind that determines whether a relationship can genuinely sustain and support two people across the long arc of a life, is about something more fundamental. It is about values, about what each person genuinely, deeply, non-negotiably believes matters in a life, how they think about family, about freedom, about security, about growth, about what they are willing to sacrifice and what is genuinely non-negotiable for them, about how they process difficulty, manage conflict, relate to vulnerability, and define what a good life actually looks like. When these fundamental values align, a relationship has a structural foundation that can support enormous amounts of external challenge, difference of opinion, and even significant conflict. Because beneath the friction, both people are oriented toward the same essential direction. But when these fundamental values are genuinely opposed, when what one person needs to feel alive and free consistently conflicts with what the other person needs to feel safe and settled, no amount of love, effort, or communication fully resolves that tension. Because the tension is not a problem to be solved, it is a description of reality. And one of the most genuinely loving things two people can do, for each other and for themselves, is to recognize that reality honestly. Rather than spending years trying to negotiate away a fundamental incompatibility, rather than slowly reshaping themselves into versions that fit the relationship better, but are further from who they actually are, rather than accumulating years of suppressed needs and deferred possibilities in service of a compatibility that was never structurally real. Now I want to address something directly, because somewhere in this conversation, a thought may have surfaced, the thought that says, but if I had just tried harder, it could have worked. That maybe with more patience, more effort, more willingness to compromise, the outcome would have been different. This thought is one of the most persistent and painful features of ending a relationship, and it deserves an honest response. Some relationships end because of insufficient effort, because the hard work of growing together was avoided, because conflict wasn't engaged honestly, because the investment required to build something real wasn't made. Those endings carry a specific weight. But many relationships end not because of insufficient effort, but despite enormous, sustained, genuine effort over long periods of time. And when a relationship ends after real effort, real investment, real care, and real commitment, the question is not whether you tried hard enough. The question is whether the relationship itself was capable of becoming what both people needed. And sometimes the honest answer is no. Not because either person is deficient, not because love was absent, but because the specific combination of those two specific people in that specific dynamic was not ultimately capable of producing what a healthy relationship needs to produce. That is not a failure of effort. That is an honest assessment of compatibility, and recognizing it as such, rather than converting it into a narrative of personal inadequacy, is one of the most important things you can do for your psychological well-being after a relationship ends. There is something that happens on the other side of an honest ending that almost no one talks about adequately, because the conversation about leaving relationships is almost entirely focused on the pain of the decision, the grief, the fear, the loss, all of which are real and deserve to be honored. But what also happens, what begins happening, slowly, as the distance from the relationship grows, is a return to yourself. The parts of you that were quietly compressed or set aside or gradually eroded inside the dynamic begin to re-emerge. The interests that faded come back. The friendships that drifted can be rebuilt. The sense of personal direction that was obscured by the constant management of the relationship becomes visible again. The emotional exhaustion that felt like a permanent feature of your life begins to lift. Not all at once, not without grief, but steadily, unmistakably, in ways that become increasingly impossible to ignore. You begin to remember what it feels like to be in a room and not be monitoring someone else's emotional state. To make a decision based purely on what you actually want. To go to sleep without the specific weight of a relationship that stopped working sitting on your chest. And this return to yourself, this slow, sometimes painful, ultimately necessary process of reclaiming your own life, is not a consolation prize for the relationship that ended. It is the actual point. Because the goal was never just to be in a relationship. The goal was always to be fully alive, in a relationship, or outside of one. And some relationships, by their nature, make full aliveness impossible while you are in them. So how do you actually know? How do you cut through the noise of emotion and fear and social pressure and genuine love and accumulated history, and know whether this relationship is something to stay and rebuild or something to honestly end? Here is what clarity actually feels like, not certainty. Clarity and certainty are not the same thing. Clarity is the moment when you stop asking whether you should leave and start asking what is keeping you from leaving. When the question shifts from, is this relationship working, to what am I afraid of losing if it ends? When you can sit quietly, genuinely, without distraction, and honestly answer the question of whether you are staying because you genuinely want this relationship, or whether you are staying because leaving feels impossible. Those are two fundamentally different answers, and you already know which one is true for you. You have probably known for longer than you are comfortable admitting, because the truth about relationships is rarely as hidden as we pretend. It is usually very clear. What is hidden is our willingness to act on what we know. Our willingness to honor the information that the relationship has been providing for months or years. Our willingness to trust ourselves enough to make a decision that is genuinely difficult in the short term in service of something genuinely important in the long term. And this is where I want to be direct with you. Staying in a relationship that has clearly ended is not loyalty. It is not love. It is not strength. At a certain point, it is simply avoidance, and avoidance has a cost. Not just to you, though the cost to you is real and significant and deserves to be taken seriously. But to them, because the person you are staying with out of fear, out of habit, out of the inability to tolerate the pain of an honest ending, that person is also not getting what they need. They are getting a version of you that is present in body, but not in spirit. A version of you that is going through the motions. A version of you that has mentally and emotionally already left, but cannot bring yourself to make it real. and that is not fair to either of you. Both of you deserve the full presence of a person who genuinely wants to be there, not the managed, depleted, obligation-driven presence of someone who has run out of reasons to stay, but cannot find the courage to go. None of this means leaving is easy. It is not. The end of a real relationship, even one that stopped working, even one that was producing real damage, carries a grief that is entirely legitimate. You are not just losing a person. You are losing a shared future, a set of daily rituals, an identity that was built around the combination of two people, a version of your life that, regardless of its problems, was familiar and structured and, in its own way, safe. That loss deserves to be grieved fully, not minimized, not rushed, not treated as simple or easy or less significant, because leaving was ultimately the right choice. But grief and regret are not the same thing, and pain and wrong are not the same thing. Something can be deeply painful and still be the right decision. Something can hurt enormously and still be, in the fullest and most honest sense, the most loving choice available. So here is where this leaves you. Every relationship eventually arrives at a fundamental question. Not the question of whether you love each other. The question of whether this relationship is still building something real, whether it is still creating growth, or whether it has become stagnation, whether it is still expanding who you both are, or whether it has become a slow process of mutual diminishment, whether you are staying because you genuinely want this specific person, this specific life, or whether you are staying because the alternative feels like more than you can currently face. That question deserves an honest answer, not the answer that is most comfortable, not the answer that requires the least immediate courage, the actual, honest answer, because you will have to live with whatever you choose, not in an abstract sense, in the daily, immediate, lived reality of your actual life. And you deserve a life that was chosen, not a life that simply continued because the decision to change it was too painful to make. The right relationship, the one you are actually meant to build, whether with this person in a genuinely renewed form or with someone else entirely, does not need fear to hold it together. It does not need exhaustion to maintain it. It doesn't need the slow erasure of who you are to survive. It needs you, fully present, fully alive, fully yourself. And whatever decision brings you closest to that, that is the decision you owe yourself the honesty to make.